Excerpts from St. Nicholas of Myra, the Unofficial Autobiography, written by Wally Metts, Jr. They got it wrong, mostly. I realize nobody wrote it down until 400 years later, and, well, my own diaries and sermons were burned during the persecution under Diocletian. But I'd like to set the record straight, after so many centuries of distortion and exaggeration. My name is Nicholas of Myra, and this is my story. I was born in 280 A.D. in Patara. It was a town of some consequence then, or at least we liked to think so. Patara was a trading center in Asia Minor, and my parents, Theophanes and Nana, were wealthy merchants. They were quite old when I was born. Maybe not as old as Sarah and Abraham in the Bible, but I know my mom did pray for a child a long time. They thought I was a gift. Frankly, they were gracious people who saw everything as a gift. My parents held their wealth lightly as a feather blowing down the stone streets, under the aqueduct and out into the wooded hills. I always knew that everything we had was never really ours. One of the monks would later write that my parents were of substantial lineage, holding property enough without superfluity. I guess it felt like superfluity at the time. We certainly lacked nothing. I had a Greek tutor, for example. He was a bodyguard, actually. I loved to hang out down near the shipyards and listen to the seamen talk about their adventures in Rhodes, Cyprus, Antioch, Alexandria, even Rome. It was more exciting than the market, with all its beads and glass and fabric. The waterfront was no place for a boy, Mom used to say, especially after I repeated a few words she didn't think I should know. But Dad just told the tutor to keep me out of trouble, more for Mom's benefit than mine. There is a lot to learn, Dad said. We both knew trouble is where you learn most of it. Learning occupied most of my day, actually, and I'm not just talking about school. I was an early reader and a good student and fortunate to have access to scrolls and such. But we also took church very seriously. In fact, the Apostle Paul had visited our city years before, and we read his letters to the other churches regularly, poring over them and memorizing them. And we read the Gospels especially. Jesus seemed so fresh and real to me, even when I was a kid. From my earliest days, I remember our talking, praying, singing, and thinking about Jesus. Because of their wealth, I think, my parents seemed particularly interested in the Gospel of Luke, since Jesus said so much there about money. This is where he says to give our gifts in secret, without the right hand knowing what the left hand was doing. It's the only way to do it, so God gets the credit. In those days, the Christians in our city often met in homes, eating together and encouraging each other. My favorite place to meet was at Stephen's house. He and Anna were good friends of my mom and dad, members of the Merchants Guild and the city council. I'm not saying I like to go there because of his 3 beautiful daughters. I was just a kid after all, if not a precocious one. I just liked that they made everyone feel welcome, even the many slaves who followed Christ, not as a slave, but as a beloved brother, as Paul wrote to Philemon. This didn't sit well with everyone. Many people were suspicious of us, especially the Romans. The Romans were suspicious of everyone. The empire was in decline, and insecurity makes men do stupid things, even evil things. It was very sobering when we heard that Polycarp had been burned at the stake. And of course, we all knew about Nero, who blamed the great fire in Rome on Christians. But we were a brave and cheerful lot. My Uncle Nicholas insisted that a life in service to Christ was a life of sacrifice and joy. My childhood was a lot more of the latter. We were both blessed and grateful. That was until the winter, the plague spread. Throughout our entire province, cutting down entire families. Ships would not come into the harbor. Caravans would not enter the city. The moneylenders were cruel, and the famine was relentless. Sometimes I prayed all night for the people in our city. I was 13. And then, one weekend, both my parents died. Mercifully, their passing was short. My grief was not. I missed Mom's laughter reverberating down the halls, and I missed Dad's wisdom. He always knew what to do, and I didn't. I still answered the door and tried to help the people asking for help. That's what they would have done. But when the door closed, the stone walls seemed harder and colder, like my heart. But it wasn't time that healed my grief. It was action. I moved in with my uncle and became more involved in his work. I spent a lot of time with the orphans. I knew what they were feeling. And I was learning that being busy was better than feeling sorry for yourself. Everywhere we turned, there were sorrows enough. Stephen even lost his fortune when 2 ships he had staked never returned. He had already lost Anna in the plague, and his debtors crowded in, threatening even to take his daughters. I knew what I had to do. My parents left me a lot of money. Since I was planning to continue my studies and enter the ministry, it wasn't going to do me much good. So, I gave them gold for their dowries. 3 bags, actually, 1 for each daughter. I tried really hard to do it in secret, dropping them through the window at night. I don't know anything about the 1 bag falling in a shoe or stocking or anything like that. It doesn't matter, really. I just know that Stephen caught me one night as I tried to sneak down the street behind their house. He was so grateful, it was embarrassing. The Chronicles got that mostly right. He said, "If the Lord, great in mercy, had not raised me up through thy generosity, then I, an unfortunate father, already long ago would be lost together with my daughters in the fire of Sodom." Or he said something very like that. Stephen always had a flair for the dramatic. I'm just glad he got the Lord, great in mercy part in there. It explains a lot, as we will see. I asked him not to tell anyone, but of course he did. I had been giving money away. A lot of money, actually. There were so many needs. People started to put 2 and 2 together and come up with 10 or something, giving me a lot more credit than I deserved. People say and do all kinds of things you can't control. Chapter 2, Becoming an Example. Regardless of what they say, I did not break my nose in a fight down in the shipyards. Yes, I loved ships and sailors and such, and I spent a lot of time with them. But you have to expect that when you're the bishop in a busy port city like Myra. And yes, I was a bit of a scrapper, as we shall see, but before we get to the story about my nose, which is not nearly as exciting as you might think, I should tell you how I got to Myra in the first place. I actually filled in for my uncle in Patara when he took a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. But the leap from student to servant is a big one. I had been leading prayers and reading scripture for some time, but suddenly people's needs were greater than I ever realized. A loaf of bread was not going to be enough. The answers I had did not always fit the questions they asked. I tried very hard not to be full of myself. What people seemed to need most of all was time. Polycarp said pastors were to be compassionate and merciful to all, bringing back those that wander, visiting all the sick, and not neglecting the widow, the orphan, or the poor. Given the devastation of the plague, there was a lot to do. But when my uncle returned, I guess the wanderlust got to me. It wasn't just the call of the ships, it was the transformation the trip had made in my uncle. Always a wise man, he seemed filled with wonder. He had walked where Jesus walked, and I wanted to do it too. There was the little matter of passage, however. I had given away the family fortune, so to speak, but I was amazed at how so many people chipped in a little for the trip. In fact, I was humbled. It seems like nothing today, but then the little jaunt down the coast, around Cyprus and along the edge of Palestine to the Roman port of Caesarea, was a little more daunting. And then there was the camel ride to Jerusalem. The Romans still ruled Jerusalem, of course, but the Christians there were gracious and, well, creative. Though much of the old city was buried under Roman construction, they welcomed me, secretly showing me the room where the Lord's Supper took place, even the place where Jesus died and where he lay until the resurrection. I remember standing outside the chamber of the high priest and looking down the rough road of Gethsemane, realizing that Jesus himself had walked that road to give his life for me. What a gift that was. And then, on the way home, there was the storm. People make a lot of this story. The way they tell it, I raised a sailor from the dead and also calmed the sea like Jesus did. It was a lot more like what Paul did in Acts. I just prayed a lot. Yes, the sea was pretty violent. Like Paul, we didn't see the stars or even the sky for days. All hope of our being saved was at last abandoned, just the way Paul remembered his own ordeal. When the sky cleared and we had drifted back to Patara, the sailors thought it was a miracle. I thought it was a miracle too. I just never thought I should get any credit for it. But the sailors talked about it for years. Sailors are like that. Anyway, I plunged back into helping my uncle, although I was torn. My trip had changed me, and I considered a monastery and a life of contemplation. There was so much I didn't know, and I wanted the time to study it, and it seemed a way to deal with my longing for adventure, to bring it under control in a more disciplined, thoughtful way. But I had my own Damascus moment. As clearly as God spoke to Paul, he spoke to me. Nicholas, here is not the field on which you must bring forth the fruit I expect, but turn back and go into the world and let my name be glorified in you. The Chronicles got this exactly right. So I never turned back. I took my vocation seriously. So did others. When the archbishop in nearby Myra died, a council of pastors asked me to take the job. But I certainly did not feel qualified. There was so much responsibility and so many needs. Someone later wrote of me, he was kind and affable to all. To orphans he was a father, to the poor a merciful giver, to the weeping a comforter, to the wronged a helper, and to all a great benefactor. I hope it was true. I was just trying to understand and follow Paul's advice to Titus. Be a model of good works, and in your teaching show integrity, dignity, and sound speech. I have to confess it was easier when I was in the abbot, before I went to jail and broke my nose, or rather, before the Roman soldier broke my nose. After the threats and the deprivation, going without food or water for days, that's when the beatings started. The great darkness under Diocletian had reached Lycia. We saw it coming, of course. The Romans had burned an entire city nearby when the Christians refused to sacrifice to the emperor. His heir, Galerius, was even worse, but many suffered more than I did. There are stories about wild beasts and iron scrapers and human torches. They are all true. Perhaps we were spared because we had been kind, not only to the slaves, but also to the Romans. Or perhaps we were spared because our distance from Rome gave our captors some space for mercy. But I expect we were spared because God knew we needed strength for the challenges to come. So in Myra, we waited in the dungeons, comforting each other, singing and worshiping, depending as always on the mercies of God. There were wounds to tend and prayers to say, We prayed for the children. And then one day, a guard beckoned me down a long, dark corridor and out into the light. I had never expected to see it again, although I imagined it every day. I gathered with my people on the public square and listened to the Edict of Milan. Constantine had conquered Rome under the sign of the cross, guaranteeing our freedom and returning our properties. I still do not give Constantine the credit. Every good gift, as James tells us, comes down from above, from the Father of lights. It was 313 AD, and I was 33.